Our next speaker up next is Jessica Ferne. She's the Director of Global Health Impact with the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, CanWaCH. She's also an OCIC, our Vice President actually, of the OCIC Board Directors. So we work with Jessica closely and we know her excellent work. So we're happy that she's here with us today. Jessica leads CanWaCH strategic efforts to strengthen Canadian monitoring and evaluation processes, capacity and collaborations in order to drive evidence-driven programming and decision-making. So very interesting work, very important work. And previously, she has worked in diverse senior program management, public health research and evaluation positions in Canada and internationally, including most recently with International Development and Relief Foundation, IDRF. So I'll leave it there and we'll hear more from Jessica.
Hello everybody. Can you hear me all right? Like Christiana, I was told not to be PowerPoint heavy, but as you heard, I am a data person, a monitoring and evaluation person. And just before coming here, I was having pre-dinner with one of my colleagues, and she is also a data person, and like me, she's like, so you're gonna have a PowerPoint presentation? I was like, oh yeah, of course I'm having a PowerPoint presentation. Because we're data people and that's what we do, but I will try not to be too much of a data nerd with you and just do a little bit of it. But if I can leave people with any message in my career, it's that information is really cool. It's cool to know things. And as we've just heard from our colleague speaking about education, having this information is really important. Using it is even more important. So I was tasked with talking about family planning, and you heard a little bit in the TED Talk referencing family planning, and I want to talk very briefly, before I go into drawing the linkages between family planning and climate change, I'm going to tell you why I'm not going to use the term family planning. Can you change the slide? Oh, sorry, there's a slide before that, I think. Okay, yeah, that's it, sorry. No, the one that... There we go. Yes, done. Wonderful. So when we talk about the language of family planning, and you heard actually just a few kind of passing comments towards the end about some of the challenges associated with using that term, there's a lot of imagery that tends to get conjured up around this idea of control, of attempting to control people's bodies and their autonomy. When in reality, what we're talking about is we're talking about choice. We're talking about the ability to control whether and when to have children. That includes everything from the use of condoms, as an example, to prevent pregnancy, or the use of menstrual health monitoring in order to become pregnant. And the language of family planning has a long history, and there's a lot tied up in that. And so we could discuss this at length. I won't make you sit with me through a whole semantics discussion, but suffice to say that the language that you'll hear a lot more often, especially in international development, is a rights-based language that really focuses on human rights and our right to control our health and our bodies. So the language that you'll hear is SRHR. We love our acronyms in development. My organization's name is an acronym. And so SRHR means Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights. I'm going to try a lot to say the whole acronym because I know it might not be familiar to all. But if I slip up and say SRHR, which I will, you'll know that I'm talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights and everything that accompanies. Sexual and reproductive health and rights. The idea here is that our sexual health and our reproductive health are closely linked together, and that embedded in this is our right to good sexual and reproductive health. And if you want to talk more about that, come find me later. So a lot of people don't know that sexual and reproductive health and rights is an area where Canada actually has been leading for a very long time. Oh yes, here's our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. How many of you know where he is right there in that photo? Not Christine, you guys know. We showed this beforehand. Where are we in this photo?
And Women Deliver.
What was Women Deliver?
A global conference on women's rights that happened like 2 weeks ago in Vancouver.
That is right. So for those of you who maybe didn't hear or are listening via Facebook, I'm sure there are many of you. So Women Deliver it's a global conference that happens every 3 years on women's rights. Canada, we kind of sometimes refer to it as the Olympics for gender equality. It happens every 3 years. Countries aim to host it. Canada was proud to host it in Vancouver just a few weeks ago. And I'm going to talk in a minute about what you're seeing up here, which is the historic investment that was announced there. But I'm actually going to take you way, way back to 2010. Certainly it starts before then, but in 2010, some of you may know that Canada launched something that was called the Muskoka Commitment, and people referred to it as the Muskoka Commitment. This was something Canada co-chaired with Tanzania, I believe, where we made a commitment of $2.85 billion over 5 years, specifically to maternal, newborn, and child health for that 5-year period of 2010 to 2015. This was under the tenure of Prime Minister Harper, and before the change in government in 2015, there was an additional commitment of $3.5 billion that sees us through till 2020, again, investing in maternal, newborn, and child health. And we are currently in the middle of that. Many of the projects that I know UNICEF and our colleagues at CFTC who couldn't be here with us have funding through that. But one of the comments that came out of that, examining the great work that was happening as part of that portfolio, was a recognition that sexual and reproductive health and rights programming was not necessarily reflected to the full extent that it needed to be, which is why in 2017, Canada committed, again, another $650 million to see us through to 2020, specifically on sexual and reproductive health and rights. So that's the money that has already been going out the door into the world, doing amazing work for women, children, adolescents, and the communities that they live in. But at Women Deliver, just a few weeks ago, there was a historic commitment, an alignment with something that is called the Thrive Agenda. And basically all you have to know is that Canada has committed $1.4 billion a year over a 10-year period. This is a historic commitment that looks specifically at the health and equality of people around the world, particularly the most vulnerable, which are women and girls. This is historic in its duration, it's historic in the amount of money that's being given, and it also really cements Canada's commitment to issues around gender equality. And so it's a very exciting time and reinforces just how important this issue is to Canada and to Canadians, and will be for the decade to come. How many of you have heard of something called the FIAP? Again, the front row, like, I always feel proud to it, I know. Sorry, so we know, anybody heard of the Feminist International Assistance Policy? If I say that, do you know what I'm talking about? A few, okay, not many. So this is really, I think, very important to know. So our government has established something called the Feminist International Assistance Policy, or FIAP, F-I-A-P. And the FIAP is what it sounds like. It is our international assistance policy. It guides how we do our international work around the world, and it is an explicitly feminist policy. Now, many people take the word feminist to mean that we're only talking about women and girls. Not true. This policy very explicitly calls out, I think it's one of the first parts of the preamble, is talking about the importance of engaging men and boys and all communities. So it takes an explicitly feminist approach to this work, and this is what is guiding everything we do. Now, what is in the FIAP is a commitment to health. It's, among other things, commitments to peace and security, commitments to education, and also commitments to environment and climate. So all of the things that we are talking about today, we actually have a policy around and a commitment to doing in the world. And that's something that a lot of us don't know about, but it's really important when we're understanding how to talk with our governments and with our elected officials about the intersections of all of these pieces. Now, separate from the work that the government supports, all of these areas are areas that are really important to Canadians generally. My organization, within my organization, I focus particularly on data, and we've actually developed an online tool, it's called the Project Explorer, that specifically tracks, and there's a picture of it. So we have a tool, this is what it looks like when you first go to the website. I mean, this is actually a map of all of the work that Canadians do around the world on a variety of topics relating to health, but also broader than health, education, global development, etc. And we give you detailed data on what all of those projects are doing, who they're reaching, in some cases the indicators that they're using to measure. This particular screenshot actually only captures the current projects that are ongoing in reproductive health and rights and sexual health at this exact moment in time. But you can search.
Canada.
I'm so sorry?
Canada, what is that one in Canada?
Oh, that's a series of, so if you drill down into this map, you would see where specific projects are.
And why is it not in Russia or the States or Europe?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, believe me, if you want to talk about this, come find me after. And also my colleague Melody, who I'm going to give a shout out to at the back. Melody, would you raise your hand? Okay. Yeah, so this is actually her baby, and she can tell you lots about it. But this is certainly not every single initiative that happens every single place. But it's a very comprehensive snapshot of where Canadians are, not just funded by the Government of Canada, but also by private donors like yourselves, other funding institutions like the Gates Foundation or the Global Financing Facility or others. The other thing that we look to do is understand trends over time in terms of subject matter areas where Canadians work. This is one of the visuals that we have developed that actually looks at all of the different top 10, we call it the top 10 areas of investment and funding year over year. Where do we see new projects being launched in what topic areas? And interestingly enough, we have this being live, but I did screenshots because I couldn't do it live. So if you switch to the next slide, I've pulled out reproductive health and rights for you. So you can see over a 10-year period, it ranks as the number 4 most common project that we have in terms of an area of focus. The ones above, I believe, include, among other things, food security and nutrition, another key area. So what I really want you to take from all of this is that Canada is already an established leader in reproductive health and rights, that we have a commitment to it as well as to climate change. So we are already ready to link these ideas. We just as a public and as a sector need to really do the legwork of bringing Canadians along. So with that said, let me dive a little bit more deeply into that. Can you, yeah, I need to do them both. Great. So one of the things that I hear a lot when we talk about how sexual and reproductive health and climate change are linked is, well, that's a bit of a long walk. You know, maybe this is a somewhat opportunistic story that we're trying to tell and to find some sort of way to link these two seemingly disparate concepts. In order to improve our advocacy. But as you heard, this is an area where different advocates, including major organizations on both sides, have been doing a lot of work for a very long time, trying to ensure that nations put SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, into their climate resiliency plans. And it was touched on a bit in the TED Talk, so I'm just going to take one quick second and really re-emphasize one of the main reasons that we tend to draw this connection centers around the issue of population growth. Yeah, that sounds right. So when we talk about population growth, we are talking about the fact that as a general rule, our population numbers are going up. We have more people on the planet than ever before, and tomorrow we will have more. However, it's not like that growth happens everywhere in the same way at the same rate. We know that there are some geographic regions that see greater, more rapid population growth than others. And not too surprisingly, if you were to take a map, data person like me loves a map, you take a map of all of the countries that are experiencing rapid rates of population growth, and then you overlay those countries that are particularly feeling today very harsh negative effects of the climate crisis. They align. The more people that you have, the greater the population in an area, the more likely there is to be a strain on the natural resources, like water or arable land. We know that with density, we have increased rise of urbanization, overcrowding, transportation needs that have to be met, waste management needs that have to be met, increased consumption, all those other things that accompany environmental degradation. And if you were to take, See, you ramble, you get so excited in the beginning. Okay, so if we're taking another map, all right, and we're overlaying, we want to add this additional layer of complexity. We're also seeing that countries that have high, rapid rising population numbers and impacts of climate change, these are also countries that tend to be experiencing economic challenges. It is hard to meet the economic needs of an increasingly growing population. As well, our planet is getting younger. We maybe don't always see that here in Canada in the same way as a national average, but youth do represent the largest and most rapidly growing demographic. And so, of course, they face unemployment, economic insecurity, and these issues get exacerbated as climate change limits their opportunities. And then when you add gender inequality to that mix and you stir, you see that young people of reproductive age are often the most vulnerable and also the least likely to be able to protect themselves and their families. And so the approach that I'm going to take to this is actually to frame it within the context of making the case to you, I guess, and also to politicians as to... What? Oh, I'm getting there. You got to ride with me, all right? This relates just to point 1. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There are multiple headings. Don't worry. I got you. So I'm going to frame it within the context of how I make the case to you and also to our leaders about why we need to make the case for the linkages between these two issues. And the first point that I'm going to make, number 1, is that people do not live their life in silos, and that is what this diagram that I lifted from the PRB exchange aims to show. And that is basically that, you know, when we talk about how we're going to fund issues, think back to what I just talked about with the Thrive agenda, right? We often think about programming and doing policy work in bits and pieces, right? So we say this is money for education and this is going to be money for health. Like these things aren't intimately connected. And that often means that we are, you know, trying to split crumbs. We're trying to figure out how to do a whole bunch of stuff with very little amount of money that we're suddenly now all kind of fighting over. But if you ask the average woman who's a farmer to talk about how to separate the money that she earns from farming for how she is going to pay for the other food that she needs to feed her kids, that's not really a distinction that she's going to make in her life. If she's walking for miles and miles and miles through unsafe communities to access water, where she's at an increased risk for experiencing sexual violence, yeah, she probably doesn't have time to think about going to the doctor and talking about her health needs or the needs of her children. So, you know, it works well on paper, but it's not how people live. These interconnected areas of health and livelihoods, food security, environment, population, all of them link very closely together because that's frankly how we live our lives. So you can't address one without addressing the other. The second point that I want to make has to do with the fact that it's just cost effective. You know, we've all heard or many of us maybe have heard the expression, it's more bang for your buck. Basically, that just means that you can maybe get more value out of the same amount of money. Well, some estimates, some of the more recent estimates put the cost of meeting existing needs for sexual and reproductive health and rights at less than 5% of the annual global spend on climate change that's recommended under the Paris Agreement. At the same time, and making sure I get my numbers right by referencing my paper here, eliminating unmet needs in sexual and reproductive health and rights would contribute to between 16 to 30% of the needed carbon emission reduction. Another way to look at that is to try to compare costs. These are big numbers, it's hard to wrap your mind around. So for instance, a similar study looked at the cost of solar power as a strategy to reduce CO2 emissions, and it put that cost at about $30 a ton. Cost of family planning investments in that same study, $4.50 per ton. So it's not just cheaper, because that would be one thing. Cheaper is cheaper, but it's cheaper and it is effective, which is the key takeaway here. Number 3, this should not be number 3. In my opinion, this is actually it. To me, this is the answer, and I can stop at this one. But that is that sexual and reproductive health and rights is a human right. And so too is the right for healthy environments. You can't address one fundamental human right as a state and then decide that you're not going to opt into the other human rights. They all go hand in hand. So if we have a moral imperative to focus on education, so too do we have a moral imperative to focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights and our climate. And then number 4, final for this slide, climate-driven population displacement and sexual and reproductive health needs are closely linked and they're growing. What do I mean by that? So before, when I was talking about my overlapping maps, if we want to add just like an additional little shiny filter to that, we would look specifically at countries that are experiencing mass displacement or migration as a result of the climate crisis. So I come from a humanitarian background. I've done work in emergency response, and I know that one of the most consistent and most consistently unmet needs during a crisis is the population health needs, the sexual and reproductive health needs of the people who are most affected. This is because healthcare lapses, educations get disrupted due to pregnancy, there are fault lines in a health system that get exposed during a crisis, and when migration happens, when people move across borders, health systems in one country might not be set up to meet the changing needs of that population. There is a rise in the number of humanitarian crises around the world. Crises are also lasting longer than ever before. It's gone are those very short-term time periods, and instead we're looking at many, many years. So even if you wanted to favor one of these strategies over another, they would go together anyway, and your health system would be forced to address them. And that links closely to number 5, which is on the next slide. Which is that both climate change and unmet family planning strain the health system. Obviously, we know that climate-related illnesses, things that are related to, let's say, malaria and dengue, increasing pollution. And if you don't know how those link to climate change, I'm happy to talk about it. These are only going to increase the strain on the health systems, also many of which rely on resources for family planning to be the backbone of their financing. So the more economic stability we have, the more ability we also have for families to be able to contribute to the health system and contribute to meeting those costs. And that's because, 6, family planning, investments in family planning are good for the economy now and in the long term. The more people who rely on natural resources for food, water, and jobs, the less likely they are to have an economic safety net. However, when we meet that safety net, that allows people to redirect those important household resources to their family's health and their family's needs. It also helps them to reduce the number of dependents that are in their care. And finally, 7, it actually brings together some interesting bedfellows, some new partners that can actually defray costs. A lot of things, we as when you work in a development organization, you're often challenged by our government and others to bring new key stakeholders to the table. What about the private sector? We get asked. And what about non-traditional partners and partnerships? The connection between family planning, SRHR, and climate change is such that it brings together new sources of funding, new people who play in one space who can actually help you to do better advocacy and addressing the others. So since I'm kind of out or low on time, I will end with my last slide, which talks a little bit about, what do we kind of take away from this? Where do we go from here? What are some of the things that we need to be thinking of? And I am a public health person, so I think in terms of systems change, not necessarily always individual level change. That's my weakness. I think my mind goes to the system first. So that's where I'm most comfortable, and that's what I'm going to talk about just really quickly. This is, I can't not plug it. This is a report that my amazing team produced. It launched just last Thursday, the Global Health Impact Report, and it talks, it features specific interesting case studies. UNICEF is in there, and other organizations are featured that are doing really interesting, innovative work around telling the stories of our impact. If you could hit my next bullet point. Being able to actually talk about what is Canada doing, what are our successes, what are the innovative tools and strategies that we've used to link climate change and sexual and reproductive health and rights. We need to do a better job of telling the story of our work, and we tried one interesting digital strategy to do that, but we're always keen to do others. The next point has to do with using an intersectional approach. Maybe you've heard the term intersectionality before, but when it comes to issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights, we need to recognize, of course, that not everybody experiences challenges to accessing their sexual and reproductive health and rights in the same way. Women living in poverty, LGBTQ2QI folks, HIV positive women, racialized women, on and on and on. These are the people that are vulnerable to having limitations on their sexual and reproductive health and rights are the same people that are vulnerable to climate change. So we need to engage those communities and ask them what solutions they need to see. And then maybe one final point has to do with laws, norms, and values. And this is something I'm just going to kind of put out here, and I'd love to get your thoughts on in the discussion, which is that I would suggest, I'm willing to put this on myself, but you can tell me if you disagree, that issues like, for example, education are generally speaking not contentious. We might all disagree on how to deliver it, or what's most important, or even who should get it, but we all generally agree that having an education is a good thing, and we're usually okay with providing it to people. We do not all feel the same way about providing access to contraceptives. We do not all feel the same way about providing access to abortion as part of comprehensive care. These things are contentious, and they often come right up against issues of religion, of values, of power differentials. It's a lot easier to pay attention to an issue when it affects you. If you're not a person of reproductive age, maybe you think about it differently. Understanding the fact that ethics and questions of laws and legality play into conversations of sexual and reproductive health and rights is really important. And it's a lens and a nuance we have to think about if we really want to drive meaningful change in this area and see its linkages with SRHR. And the way we do that, and this is truly the final point, is we do that through data, good information, good quality information. We do it through using that information to do effective, meaningful advocacy, and then we do it by engaging and using the power that Canada has at the global stage, the money that we've put forward, the political clout that we enjoy, to truly push ourselves and our global partners to move the dial on both of these issues together. And I believe that.